The wind howled through the cold city streets as the man sat hunched over on the pavement, his tattered coat barely shielding him from the biting chill. His hair was unkempt, his beard overgrown, and his hands bore the signs of hardship, cracked, calloused, and dirt-streaked. To the world, he was just another homeless man, invisible to the passers-by who rushed by, their eyes avoiding his presence. But what they didn't know, what no one knew, was that beneath the layers of worn-out fabric and behind the guise of despair lay a billionaire, a man who had built an empire, a man who had once commanded boardrooms and brokered million-dollar deals with a mere nod of his head. Tonight, however, he was a nobody. The plan had been his own. He wanted to see how the world, his world, truly operated when no one recognized him. He wanted to test his own institution, his own employees, and most importantly, his own core belief that money in the right hands could shape society for the better. But before he could change anything, he needed to know the truth. He sat outside one of the many branches of his bank, watching as well-dressed customers entered and exited, each carrying with them the air of importance that financial power granted them. No one spared him a second glance. Some even went out of their way to step around him, as though proximity alone could taint them. He slowly stood up, stretching his aching limbs before shuffling toward the grand glass doors of the bank. As he reached for the handle, a voice cut through the air. "Hey, where do you think you're going?" A security guard, broad-shouldered and towering, stepped in front of him, blocking his path. The billionaire-turned-homeless man lifted his gaze, meeting the officer's hardened stare. "I need to make a withdrawal," he said, his voice hoarse yet steady. The guard snorted. "Yeah, right. Move along. This isn't a shelter." "I have an account here," the man insisted. The guard scoffed, glancing at his appearance. "Look, I don't know what game you're playing, but people like you don't have accounts here. Now move before I call the cops." The billionaire clenched his fists inside his coat pockets. He had anticipated resistance, but not this level of outright dismissal. He took a deep breath and stepped forward again. "I have my account number," he said, keeping his tone even. "If you'll just let me speak to a manager—" The guard pushed him back, not roughly, but enough to make it clear that he wasn't welcome. "I'm not going to tell you again." For a moment, the billionaire considered revealing his identity right then and there. But no, that would defeat the purpose. Instead, he simply nodded and stepped away, but not before memorizing the guard's badge number. He walked down the street, stopping at a convenience store window to catch his reflection. He looked every bit the part of a man society had cast aside. With a sigh, he turned away and headed toward a nearby alley, where he had stashed a small bag containing a burner phone and a few essential documents. He needed to try again, but this time he had to be smarter about it. The next morning he returned, slipping into the bank just as the doors opened. This time he avoided the security guard and went straight to the first available teller. The young woman behind the counter barely glanced at him before wrinkling her nose. "How can I help you?" she asked, her voice laced with forced politeness. "I need to withdraw money from my account," he said, placing a slip of paper with his account number on the counter. She took one look at it and smirked. "Sir, this account has millions of dollars in it. You're telling me this is yours?" "Yes," he replied simply. She laughed, shaking her head. "All right, where's your ID?" He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his wallet, placing an old, slightly worn-out driver's license in front of her. She picked it up, examined it, and frowned. "This can't be real," she muttered, before turning to her colleague. "Hey, check this out. This guy says he owns an account with millions in it." A second teller leaned over, took one look at the license, and chuckled. "Nice try, buddy. I don't know where you got this, but it's not fooling anyone." The billionaire exhaled slowly, his patience wearing thin. "Call the bank manager," he said, his voice sharper now. The first teller raised an eyebrow. "The manager doesn't have time to deal with scams." "Call the manager." There was something in his tone that made her hesitate. After a moment, she sighed and picked up the phone. "Mr. Reynolds?" "Yeah, we've got a situation up front." A few minutes later, a sharply dressed man in his 40s approached the counter. "What seems to be the issue?" he asked, looking at the teller first before shifting his gaze to the billionaire. "This gentleman claims to have an account here," she said, handing over the slip of paper. Reynolds took one glance at it, then at the billionaire, and scoffed. "Is this some kind of joke?" "No joke," the billionaire said. If you check the account, you'll see my name is on it. Reynolds sighed, shaking his head. Sir, we don't entertain pranks. I'll have to ask you to leave. The billionaire didn't move. You should check. Reynolds narrowed his eyes but finally typed the account number into his computer. A moment later, his expression changed. His face paled, his lips parted slightly, and he cleared his throat before looking up. This account belongs to me, the billionaire finished. Now I suggest you verify my identity properly before making any further assumptions. But before Reynolds could respond, the security guard from the previous night stormed over. Sir, I warned you. Wait, Reynolds interrupted, standing up straighter. Do you have another form of identification? The billionaire nodded and reached into his coat, pulling out a business card, one that bore his name, the same name tied to the multi-million-dollar account. Reynolds swallowed hard. The tellers, who had been laughing moments before, now looked at each other in horror. The security guard took a step back, confusion clouding his features. But the billionaire wasn't done yet. This bank, he said quietly, belongs to me. The room fell into stunned silence. He let the weight of his words settle before he spoke again. And now I'm going to see how deep this problem really runs. The stunned silence in the bank lobby stretched for an eternity. No one dared to speak, least of all the tellers who had laughed just moments ago. The billionaire, still clad in his tattered clothing, watched as the weight of his revelation sank into those who had treated him with contempt. He had expected disbelief, but the sheer panic that flickered in their eyes was satisfying in a way he hadn't anticipated. He had come here seeking answers, but now he realized he had uncovered something much darker, an institution that had lost the very principles it claimed to uphold. Reynolds, the bank manager, swallowed hard, his professional demeanor faltering. Sir, I apologize for the misunderstanding. If you could step into my office, we can clear this up. The billionaire held his ground. Clear it up? You and your staff refused service to a man based solely on his appearance. If I weren't the account holder, would you have even bothered to check? Reynolds hesitated, his gaze darting toward the security guard, who had taken a step back, suddenly uncertain of his authority. Sir, we have procedures. Procedures? The billionaire cut in sharply. Is it standard procedure to humiliate potential clients? To assume that someone who doesn't fit your expectations is a scam artist? Tell me, Reynolds, what exactly does your training manual say about basic human decency? The manager had no answer. Instead, he gestured toward his office again. Please, sir, let's discuss this privately. A wry smile tugged at the billionaire's lips. You were more than happy to mock me in public. I think we'll keep this discussion right here. The tension in the air grew thick as more employees and customers tuned into the confrontation. Whispers spread like wildfire, and soon the entire bank floor was abuzz. The tellers who had sneered at him moments ago stood frozen, their faces drained of color. One of them, the young woman who had laughed outright, stepped forward, her voice trembling. Sir, I'm sorry, I didn't know. That's the problem, he interrupted. You didn't bother to know. You saw a man who didn't fit your mold and dismissed him without a second thought. Reynolds was visibly sweating now. Sir, please, let's not make a scene. We value all our customers. The billionaire's smile faded. Do you, or do you just value the ones who walk in wearing expensive suits? A murmur rippled through the growing crowd. Even some of the customers seemed uncomfortable now, shifting awkwardly as they watched the scene unfold. Then a voice broke through the murmurs. A woman in her 60s who had been watching from a corner. He's right, she said, stepping forward. I've banked here for years, and I've seen how you treat people. If someone doesn't look the part, you treat them like they don't belong. More customers nodded in agreement. A man in a crisp business suit muttered, I've seen it happen too. Not to me, but to others. Reynolds's face turned an unhealthy shade of red. He looked around, desperate for a way out of this nightmare. Sir, if you'll allow me to make this right, we'll process your withdrawal immediately. The billionaire shook his head. It's not about the withdrawal, it's about the principle. You think fixing this means handing me cash and sending me on my way? Reynolds' shoulders slumped. What do you want? The billionaire's eyes darkened. Change. Reynolds blinked. Excuse me? You heard me, the billionaire said firmly. You see, I'm not just a man with money. I'm a man who built this bank. And if this is how my employees behave when they think no one important is watching, then something is very, very wrong. A gasp rippled through the staff. The realization that their employer had just exposed their shortcomings in front of an audience was overwhelming. I'm not going anywhere, the billionaire continued. Not until I understand exactly how deep this rot goes. Reynolds wiped his brow. Sir, we can conduct an internal investigation. I'll be conducting it myself, the billionaire said coldly. And trust me, heads are going to roll. At that moment, the doors swung open, and two men in sharp suits walked in. The billionaire recognized them instantly, two of his top executives. They had been waiting nearby, watching from a distance in case he needed backup. Now they approached with measured strides, their presence adding an unspoken authority to the already charged atmosphere. Sir, one of them said, addressing the billionaire, we've started reviewing the surveillance footage as per your request. It's not looking good. Reynolds turned ghostly pale. What? What do you mean? The second executive stepped forward, holding up a tablet. Multiple instances of customer mistreatment, staff ignoring certain customers, security profiling individuals based on appearance, and, he scrolled, his expression darkening, employees mocking clients behind their backs. The billionaire's jaw tightened. And who trained them to behave this way? Reynolds stammered. We have a standard training program. The billionaire raised an eyebrow. And where does humiliating customers fit into that training? No answer. The silence was deafening. Finally, the billionaire turned to the customers who had gathered. I want to hear from you. How many of you have ever felt disrespected in this bank? A dozen hands went up. That's all I need to know. He turned back to his executives. Effective immediately, I want a full audit on this branch. Every employee's record, every complaint filed. If someone here isn't treating people with the respect they deserve, they won't be working here much longer. The weight of his words hung in the air. This wasn't just a test anymore. This was a reckoning. Reynolds swallowed hard. Sir, please. The billionaire stared at him for a long moment. You should have thought of that before you turned people away based on nothing but their clothes. Then he stepped back, his voice calm but final. Consider yourself on probation. Reynolds' face drained of all color. The billionaire turned toward the rest of the employees. And as for the rest of you, if I ever catch another instance of mistreatment, you won't just lose your jobs. I'll make sure you never work in banking again. He let the words sink in before he finally turned toward the doors. We're done here. For now. The doors swung shut behind him, but the echoes of his words remained. The staff stood frozen, the customers murmured, and Reynolds slumped into his chair, realizing his entire career had just been placed on the thinnest of ice. The billionaire walked into the cold city streets once again, but now he wasn't just a man in disguise. Now he was a man on a mission. The billionaire stepped out into the crisp night air, his breath visible in the cold as he processed everything that had transpired inside the bank. His initial plan had been simple: test his own institution by experiencing it from the perspective of someone society often ignored. What he hadn't anticipated was the sheer depth of the rot within. He had witnessed it firsthand. The dismissiveness, the condescension, the outright discrimination. And now he had the power to fix it. He pulled his coat tighter around himself, more out of habit than necessity, and walked toward the awaiting car parked discreetly down the block. One of his senior executives, Foster, was already waiting inside. As he slid into the passenger seat, Foster handed him a tablet. We ran a full audit on not just that branch, but others as well, Foster said, his tone grave. The results aren't good. The billionaire scrolled through the reports, his jaw tightening as he read case after case of mistreatment, overlooked complaints, and unethical practices. This isn't just an isolated incident, he murmured. It's systemic. Foster nodded. It gets worse. Some of the managers have been intentionally setting quotas that force tellers to prioritize wealthy clients while subtly discouraging service to those they deem undesirable. And it's not just limited to one location. This culture has been spreading through the institution for years. The billionaire clenched his fists. He had built this bank with the belief that financial institutions should serve everyone, not just the privileged few. But somehow, along the way, the very values he had fought to uphold had been eroded by greed and bias. He set the tablet down, his decision already made. Call an emergency board meeting. I want every regional manager present. And get our PR team ready. We're about to make some big changes. The next morning, the boardroom was filled with executives, each of them tense as they waited for him to speak. The billionaire took his time, letting the silence settle before he finally addressed them. I spent the last 2 days undercover at one of our own branches, he began. The murmurs started immediately, but he raised a hand, and they fell silent. What I saw was unacceptable. Disrespect, discrimination, a culture of greed over service, and it stops today. A few executives exchanged uneasy glances, but no one dared interrupt. I have here, he continued, lifting the tablet, a report detailing systemic failures across multiple branches. If I could find this much in just 2 days, imagine what's been overlooked for years. The COO, a man in his late 50s named Callahan, cleared his throat. Sir, surely we can address these issues through internal corrective measures. There's no need for drastic action. There is every need, the billionaire cut in. And if you think otherwise, you're part of the problem. Callahan went silent, his face reddening. The billionaire turned to Foster. Announce a full restructuring, effective immediately. Regional managers will undergo retraining, and any employees found engaging in discriminatory behavior will be terminated. We will also be launching an outreach program to provide better financial services for underprivileged communities. Another executive hesitated before speaking. Sir, with all due respect, this kind of public action could damage investor confidence. The billionaire's gaze was cold. Then let them pull their money. I didn't build this bank to cater to investors at the cost of human decency. Silence filled the room. He let the weight of his words settle before continuing. We will also be implementing a direct customer feedback system. I want to hear from the people we serve, unfiltered. If a single branch fails to uphold these new standards, its leadership will be replaced. The decision was final. One by one, the executives nodded, some reluctantly, others with genuine acceptance. They knew better than to argue. This was no longer just a policy shift. This was a reckoning. Over the next few weeks, the bank underwent the most significant transformation in its history. Employees were retrained, policies were rewritten, and transparency became the cornerstone of operations. News of the billionaire's undercover operation spread like wildfire, garnering both praise and criticism. Some called it a publicity stunt, while others saw it as a necessary step toward reform. But for the billionaire, it was never about public perception. It was about responsibility. One afternoon, he returned to the same branch where his journey had begun. This time, he walked in wearing his usual tailored suit. The atmosphere was different. The same tellers who had mocked him now straightened up as soon as he entered, their faces filled with recognition and regret. The security guard, the one who had pushed him out, avoided his gaze altogether. He walked up to the counter where the young woman who had laughed at him now stood, visibly nervous. She swallowed hard. Sir, I just want to say I'm sorry. He studied her for a long moment before nodding. I don't need an apology. I need you to be better. She nodded quickly. I will be. Satisfied, he turned and walked out. He had seen enough to know that change was taking root. But his mission wasn't over. It never would be. Because as long as there were those who judged others by their appearance rather than their character, his work would never be done. As he stepped into the waiting car, Foster turned to him. What now? The billionaire glanced out the window, watching the city move around him. Now? He exhaled slowly. Now we make sure this never happens again.